who invited me to speak today. My name is Floyd Shimomura, and as indicated, I graduated from Winters High School in 1966 when there were only 62 students in our class. And I understand now an average class has around 150. So the school really has grown. But I grew up out on the Horseshoe west of town on the old Bassett farm, which is now the Mariani farm. And my family has lived in this area for well over 100 years. In fact, my grandfather, Itaro, who's in this picture, was born in 1883 in Wakayama, Japan, and lived to be 82 years old, so almost 100 years. And then my father, Ben Shimomura, you may have read about him in the Winters Express, turned 100 in December. So I'm very fortunate that I come from a family where people lived a long time. And so a lot of family history has been preserved, both here and back in Wakayama. Now, Wakayama is a area or city in Japan that's near Osaka and Tokyo. And in 1906, Itaro decided that maybe he had to do something with his life. He was 23 years old. He was raised by a single mom. He lost his father when he was only about 9 or 10 months old. So he had no prospects for any family inheritance. And in those days, Japan was very poor. And so he decided he had to set out on his own. Some of the boys, older boys in his village, had gone to California to a place called Wintazu. And they said, hey, there's lots of jobs out here on the farms. And they pay about $1 a day for farm labor. And you only make about 10 cents an hour, or 10 cents a day back in Japan. So my grandfather, Itaro, decided that he would follow his friends from his village and come to California. So in 1906, he got on a steamer and crossed the Pacific Ocean and landed in San Francisco Bay and had to report to Angel Island, where all new immigrants came in. And according to his immigration papers, he only had $3.50 in his pocket. Now, as I said, in Japan, a farm laborer could make 10 cents a day. So in his mind, he had like a month's salary. But in California, a day laborer only made about $1 a day. So $3.50 would only be about 3 or 4 days' wages. So this was one of the misunderstandings that he had. Yes, wages might be 10 times higher in California, but the cost of living was also 10 times higher. So welcome to reality. But 1906 is a very famous day in this area. So what else happened in 1906? If you peek down at the bottom of the screen on the right, most of you will know that there was a big earthquake, the Great San Francisco earthquake that leveled the Bay Area. Now, my grandfather Itaro, he arrived in late February 1906 and then went to Martinez, which was not too far from Angel Island, to stay with some of his friends who also came from his village before. But about 6 weeks after he came, the great earthquake occurred and shook everything up in Martinez as well as the San Francisco area. So he decided that he was going to go inland and try and meet up with his buddies who had gone to a place called Wintazu. So Itaro arrives in Winters in 1906. Now up on the upper right-hand side of the screen, you see it's not a photograph, it's really more of a artwork, a lithograph that was made of Winters and I think it depicts a time of around 1880. So maybe 20 years before Itaro arrived, but you can tell from the viewpoint that we're looking west towards the mountains. On the left-hand side of the picture here, you can see the railroad train coming in over the bridge. And at that time, the bridge was still the old wooden bridge. But when Itaro arrived in 1906, they were building the new steel bridge, so that would have been different. Now, if you look at that picture, and I'm trying to get the pointer to come over here, this little building here is the railroad station. And right there, across the street from the railroad station, on the corner of Abbey and Railroad Avenue, was a boarding house. And at that time, you know, if you were a single unemployed male, especially from Japan, you had to have some place to stay. So it's quite likely that he stayed at that boarding house. Now that boarding house is located, ironically, right where the new Winters Hotel is located today. But when Itaro went into the boarding house, he would have met a person, and I'm named Toyokichi Uenishi, who was from a nearby village in Japan. And he didn't know it, but he was meeting his future father-in-law. Because as it turned out, a few years after Itaro arrived, Toyokichi had his wife, Sugie, and daughter, Sawano, come to Winters to help run the boarding house. And Sawano, who's pictured here on the far right, ultimately became Itaro's wife. Now, the other thing is, so here's the boarding house right here. Now, if you move to this area here, right by the railroad bridge, now that's the area where the community center is today. But that became the famous Section 4, where the Japantown grew up. And before that, there was a Chinese settlement there. And what happened was that after Itaro got married to Sawano in 1915, in January of 1915, in June of that year, the Winter City Council passed an ordinance that said all Orientals had to live in Section 4, which is this area here, the block where the community center is today. And they said that it would be a nuisance for any landowner to either rent or sell to a Oriental. And so, as you know from this picture here, the boarding house was about 1 block away from Section 4. And they had to close down the boarding house. Now, after that, Itaro and his wife and Toyokichi had to move out to the Horseshoe area and work on the farms and live out in that area. And that's actually the area that I grew up in the 1950s before I graduated from high school. Okay. So Itaro and Sawano, my grandmother and grandfather, they settled down in Winters, and lo and behold, they started a family. And the slide, but everything was, let's say life was very hard during those days, and the number of babies that died was very high. And the slide that I have here is not a very good one, but it shows my grandmother's first baby that passed away later on in 1915. And his name is Shigeru Shimomura. And that tombstone is in Sacramento. Because that's where she went to get a midwife to help her have her baby. And Shigeru only lived 1 day. So very sad when you see his tombstone, because day of birth and death are the same. And the tombstone, as I said, is unusual because it's written partly in English and partly in Japanese. And you notice from the photograph that there's a big line that goes through the bottom of that tombstone. And later on in this presentation, we'll get back to that and the story behind that. But my grandmother was very successful in raising 2 kids. The little boy with the cap on in the middle picture is my father, Ben Shimomura. And this picture is taken in about 1925 because my aunt Harumi is sitting on my grandmother's lap. And then the picture on the far left was taken in 1933. And you can see that my father is now maybe 12 or 13 years old and has grown up quite a bit. And my aunt can stand up and walk. All right, this is the picture of Apricot School in 1930. Now, Apricot School is on Horseshoe Road, right at the northwest corner where it rejoins Highway 128. And in those days, They didn't have a school bus, so most kids had to walk to school or ride their bicycle. So Apricot School was one of the country schools in the Winter School District area. And there were several others, Buckeye School, there was Wolfskill School on the Solano County side, and there was Olive Pleasant Valley School, which is also in Solano County near Lake Solano. And so the grammar school kids were spread out in all these little farm schools, country schools, and then the kids that grew up in the city of Winters, they went to what they called the town school. Now, this is Apricot School, and here's my father, Ben. And if you look at the picture, there's about almost 40 students, and about a third of them are Japanese kids. About a third are of Spanish descent, and about a third are more Anglo in origin. So at that time, even though my Issei grandfather, because he spoke Japanese, they had their own kind of separate society that they lived in amongst themselves, the Japanese immigrants. But the children really grew up in a very integrated environment. And in this one school, you had grades 1 through 8. So for your teachers out there, just think of trying to teach 40 students in 3 different age groups. Pretty tough job. About the same time as the picture of the Apricot School, the Japanese community decided to build their own Japanese school. And this picture was taken in November of 1930, and shows the new school building. Now, this new school building is only about 2 blocks from here, and it's now part of Double M Trucking. That building was taken over, and so it's right near the Mariani offices. And it's interesting from 2 perspectives. One, it shows how many children there were now in Winters. But 2, this school actually became Winters High School for a few years, believe it or not. What happened was in 1943, in January, the old Winters High School burnt down. This is during World War II. And at that time, the entire Japanese community had been put in concentration camps, as you know. And so that school was actually available for use as a general school. It had a room for about 3 or 4 classrooms, and had a stage so you can have performances and give speeches and things like that. And it had a kitchen. So it was kind of a ready-made backup. You also notice that there are some cars in the background, so you can see what the state of the car technology was in 1930. Okay, you saw Ben when he was about 5 years old, and then you saw him when he was about 10 years old at Apricot School. Now this is a picture of my dad, Ben, when he was at Winters High School. Okay, he graduated as a member of the class of 1939. And I just picked out a few things to give you an idea of what his high school life was like. On the far left, you could see that he was on the front page of the Poppy. He's that guy standing up, leaning against the pillar. And the picture right next to that is from the yearbook. And that's a picture of my dad's senior class, or at least the second half of the alphabet. But what you notice is that out of the 15 students on that picture, 5 were of Japanese ancestry. And so that'll give you a clue that just like the ratio at Apricot School was about 1/3 Japanese, even in high school, that same group of kids about that age comprised about 1/3 of the population at the high school level. You also see my dad in his fancy 1929 Model Ford A car. By the time this picture was taken, it was 10 years old and not in very good shape, but he said he thought it was the greatest car in the world at that time. And my dad also played on the sports team. And you can see there he is, right near the front. They said he was a pretty fast runner. This looks like his picture from the track team, but he played on the varsity baseball team for 4 years and played second base. So baseball was his sport. And then on the bottom right picture, you can see a picture of my dad packing apricots during the summertime, because that's what the high school students did in winters during that period. So, from my father's perspective, he was fully integrated into the community. He was well liked. He played on the team, and I think the city of Winters was a good place for him, and he always has very fond memories of Winters High School. But unfortunately, 2 years after he graduated, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and World War II started, at least in the Pacific. And this sent a great big shock through the country, and particularly on the West Coast and out here in California. So in that newspaper article, which is dated February 20th, 1942, and it's from Winters newspaper. It says, American Legion, Service Club, and City Council demand concentration, supervision of enemy aliens and their holdings. So because of the war panic that occurred, the people were generally afraid here in Winters and in California that the Japanese might attack California, San Francisco, just like they had attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, that now they became very suspicious and afraid of the Japanese who were living in California. In fact, right after Pearl Harbor, a curfew was put in place, and Japanese Americans could not go more than 5 miles from their home. And you can get arrested if you were found outside of that area. Also, all guns and knives were confiscated by the police, and all radios, whether they were shortwave or just commercial. So there was a lot of tension after Pearl Harbor. And on the far right, you'll see Civilian Exclusion Order number 78 that was issued on May 18th, 1942. And in that, people were Japanese, all people of Japanese ancestry, whether aliens or non-aliens, were required to report to the American Legion Hall on Bush Street in Woodland and register by May 16th. So they were given 2 days notice. And my dad said he got on his 1929 Ford A and went down to American Legion Hall in Woodland, and he registered for his family. And he was given a camp number, or a number called number 30980, 30,980. And that became his name for the next 3 years, and family's name. The family was required to report to the Woodland train station about 5 days later. And here's a picture taken by the famous photographer Dorothea Lange. The pictures on the far left and far right of the people in Yolo County who were rounded up to be taken away. And the pictures in the middle are my grandmother and grandfather. And you can see my grandfather, he wrote his name, Itaro Ben Shimomura. And my grandmother, she couldn't write English, so she had to put an X on her papers. And this was her alien registration card that she had to keep at all times. And I talked to my dad about this, and he said this was this was the saddest day of his life. It wasn't just in Winters, but all over the West Coast, Japanese and Japanese Americans were removed from the West Coast and taken to camps, mostly inland. There were 120,000. About 40,000 were Japanese nationals, basically the Issei, the original Japanese that came over, like my grandfather Itaro, and 80,000 were Nisei, or second generation, and like my father, who were born in the United States and were American citizens. The Japanese in Winters were taken to 2 different camps. Those in Yolo County, like my father, were taken to Amachi, or it says Granada, Amachi in Colorado. And the people on the Solano County side of the river were taken to Gila River in Arizona. So here are pictures of my dad at the Amachi incarceration camp in Colorado. You can see that it was just very temporary barracks that were put up in the middle of a very desolate area of Colorado. The buildings were very flimsy. They were just frame barracks with slats and tar paper. So it was like living in a big tent, essentially. Kept maybe the wind off you and gave you a little shade, but in the wintertime when it snowed, it was very cold. And in the summertime, it could be well over 100 degrees. So it was a pretty miserable existence. There was no cooking in the barracks, and so everyone ate at a big mess hall, and there were showers and washing facilities were all communal. So it was a very tough time. I think you did some study and about Johnny Hatanaka, who went into the Army and fought in the 442nd. And so, as you know, that they were one of the most highly decorated regiments in American history for its size, and fought bravely in Europe. So I won't go into that. My father was not taken into the Army, and it was because he was the eldest and sole son. His mom and dad were both in the late 50s or 60s, and he had a younger sister. So the draft board in Yolo County decided that he didn't have to go into the Army. Instead, he worked in the motor pool at the camp. And here's some, you see a picture of, and he drove a big truck and did maintenance work on it and made deliveries around the camp of food and other things. But so his life was pretty boring compared to Johnny Hatanaka's. On the other hand, there were some positive things that happened in camp. And one of them was there was this girl named Lois Morimoto who worked in the dispatch office. And this is her. And she ultimately became my mother. So this is the picture of my dad, Ben, and my mom. They were had their wedding in Denver in March of 1945. So this was even before World War II was totally over. It was very near the end of the war. But towards the end of the war, in the last year or so, things lightened up a little bit, and they were starting to let some of the people who wanted to leave the camp if they could find some job in the local area. So here's a nice picture of my mom and dad at the wedding, and then my grandmother and grandfather are on the far right. But now the question was, where do we go from here? Now this is probably was one of the most dangerous periods. You would think that maybe during the war hysteria time, there'd be a lot of violence against Japanese and Japanese Americans on the West Coast. There was tension, but not that much violence. Ironically, that was not true at the end of the war. This is a very poor picture right here of one of the stores in Japantown in winters. This is in section 4, you know, where the community center is, right next to the railroad bridge. And there are only about 4 or 5 buildings there: general store, a fish market, a small Buddhist temple, and some boarding houses. But on VJ Day, and that was the day when Japan surrendered in, I think that was in August of 1945. Everyone was so happy in winters that they went down to Main Street and had a big celebration. And you know, this was happening all over the United States on VJ Day. And that night, this building, as well as all the other buildings, were burnt down. Okay, and signs like the one you see by the winter city limits really express the general sentiment of the people in winters at that time. It says, "No more Japs wanted here." Now, I think one thing that you should think about is, why is it that this building stood all through the war with Japan and nothing happened to it? But when the war was over, in fact, on the very day the war was over, it got burnt down. Now, I think it's pretty clear that some people were trying to send the message, we don't want you back, because there was no more fear of winters being attacked at that point in time. And maybe that's something that you can discuss with your teachers as to why that might have been the sentiment. So before the war, there were about 70 families in winters, Japanese families, and I think almost 275 or almost 300 Japanese living in the Winters area. But out of the 70 families, only about 10 came back, and the reason why is that most of the other families felt like they weren't wanted in winters. And so from a time when Winters High School had almost 1/3 of its population were students of Japanese ancestry, after that, there was hardly any. And in fact, I think that's just about what the situation is today. However, not all of the people in Winters turned their backs on the former residents. And one of the families was the Tufts family. And here's a picture of Professor Tufts. He was a professor of pomology at UC Davis, and he owned a farm out on the Horseshoe, and they still have that farm today. And he welcomed back my dad and grandfather Itado, invited them to come to live on his farm. And my brother was born in 1946, right at the end of the war. And that little baby is me. I was born in 1948, and my mom's carried me, and I'm in the little cottage right next to the Tufts main house. And it only had it was a very small cottage with 2 bedrooms and a small kitchen and living room. But my mom felt like that was a palace, because after living in camp, just having your own kitchen and bathroom. I mean, that was like heaven. And the picture on the far left in the corner is my brother and I, Sam and myself, and we're playing with Vicky Tufts, who is granddaughter of Professor Tufts. She and I were same age and classmates, and we like to play cowboys and robbers together. So the Shimomura family has been eternally grateful to the Tufts family for giving us a chance to return to Winters. So the next slide shows us Mary J. Bassett. And she sold her ranch to my father in 1953. Now, Mary J. Bassett, she's also guardian angel and eternally grateful for her. She never lived in Winters, but her family owned a farm on the Horseshoe, and her uncle kind of managed that farm before World War II. And Mary J. Bassett, she lived in Baltimore, came from a very wealthy family. She went to Vassar, famous women's Ivy League school. She taught in a private private boys' school back east, and they had a lot of property in not only in Baltimore, but in Iowa. So she was very good and sold that ranch to my father, who later sold the ranch to the Mariani family. So you might have some idea of where it is. It's on the south leg of the Horseshoe. But that's where I grew up. And as well as my brothers and sisters. And so everything worked out very, very nicely for the Shimomura family on our return to Winters. Okay. Just to wrap up this last part, here's a picture of me in front of the old Winters High School, and I'm pointing. And this was a picture that was taken when I had been elected Youth Day Mayor. And the people on my right are my city council people. So they're all my good friends, and I don't know if they still have that tradition, but at that time, we thought this was a pretty fun and important thing. And from that time, the picture on the right shows me in front of the Smithsonian Institution and in Washington, D.C., before the National Museum of American History. And as it turned out, I got some of my papers put there. Because after I graduated from Winters High School, I went to law school at UC Davis and graduated and went to work at the State Attorney General's office in Sacramento, as well as other state agencies. But I also got involved with the Japanese American Citizens League, and I became the first Sansei president in 1982. And Sansei means third generation. So before the organization, all the presidents had been second generation, people like my father's age. And there I was 34 years old when I was elected national president. And one of the things I was interested in was in getting redress and compensation for my grandfather and mother and mother and father and uncles and aunts for the unjust incarceration during World War II, because they thought that maybe they were spies or something like that. But as it turned out, Japanese Americans, over 5,000 of them, worked for the Army military intelligence. And rather than being spies against the United States, they were intercepting Japanese messages in the Pacific. And so they ended up being exactly the opposite of a spy for Japan. They became, in effect, spies for America. And also, people thought that people in the Japanese American community might commit sabotage and were disloyal. But as Johnny Hatanaka's story points out, over 14,000 Japanese Americans fought for the United States in World War II in Europe, and became one of the most highly decorated units. But I was interested in getting compensation, and many of the people in the Japanese American community, particularly the older ones, were, let's say, they were not enthusiastic about it. And they said, Floyd, you're just a young, idealistic kid, basically, which I was. And he said, we got kicked out, and they slammed the door. And then when the war was open, they wouldn't let us back in. And so you're just going to get up and give them a chance to kick us out one more time. And I said, no. I said, there was war hysteria going on at that time. And there are a lot of good people who I think once they calm down will be willing to apologize and make compensation. And in my mind, I thought, well, my experience was the Tuss family and also Mary Jane Bassett. And they were very kind to us. And I knew that that they were not the only people in the United States who were like that. So I went on a big campaign to help get redress. One of the things I did was I went to Tokyo and I met with Prime Minister Nakasone in 1983. And he was going to meet Ronald Reagan, President Reagan. Ronald Reagan was going to give a speech to the Japanese parliament. So I visited Prime Minister Nakasone 10 days before Reagan arrived. And Prime Minister Nakasone asked me, well, he said, President Reagan's going to be staying at my house, and he's talking about this big mansion that prime ministers live in. And he's going to be staying there for a couple of days. He says, is there anything that you want me to tell him? And I said, yes, sign the new redress bills that have just been introduced. And he said, which in Japanese means, maybe I will and maybe I won't. And as it turned out, he did. 10 years later, when the archives looked at the Ronald Reagan's legislative files, they found there's indications that the Japanese government recommended for about 3 or 4 month period of time, were actively lobbying for the redress bill. I also testified before a Senate committee in redress. And I was national president, and so there I am sitting between Min Yasui and John Tateishi, two really great people. I also met with top Reagan officials in the White House in August of 1984. This is the West Wing of the White House. On the second floor, we met with Jack Svahn, President Reagan's top national domestic policy advisor. And we met with him because the legislative unit of the White House reported to him. Hey, and 4 years later, Ronald Reagan signed our redress bill on August 8th, 1988. And that was a happy and glorious day for the Japanese American community. And after that, the Smithsonian Institution became interested in my redress papers, because when I was national president, I also wrote JACL's legal briefs and arguments and my speeches. And one of the things that they're interested in was the fact that I have autographed copies of the original redress bills, and that's up in the far right corner. And they had a big exhibit in 2017 talking about the incarceration and the redress campaign. So I'm very proud of that. And so I want to close the presentation by saying thank you. And also, I'm kind of starting or ending where I started this program. If you look at this picture on the right, I think most of us will recognize that this is the old railroad bridge looking from the south side, looking north towards the town. But if you look down at the shadow, can you see the date there? It says 1906. That was the year that my grandfather came here. And during May, if you go down to the bridge around noontime, so you can do it right now, if you're not in class, you'll see 1906 down there, all right? So when you see it, just remember that that's when my grandfather, Itaru Shimomura, first came to Winners. And I think our family has contributed greatly to this community here and also to the United States of America.
Well, thank you, Floyd, so much. We only have a couple minutes for questions. Thank you so much. Let's give Mr. Shimomura air clap. We only have a couple minutes for questions. So I compiled all the questions from the students from their assignment. And so one of the questions they were wondering was, did your dad ever want to fight back while being in the internment camps? Was there ever a point where he was like, I'm leaving this place or something like that?
No, I don't think so. I think he was acceptance of the situation that he was in. But that wasn't his reaction to it, no.
Another question was, what would happen if somebody said they weren't going to go? Like they weren't going to go to internment camp? What would happen to those people?
Well, they would be arrested and put in a federal jail. And several people did do that, like Fred Korimatsu. And he was arrested and he challenged it. And his case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court and he lost.
I
Okay,
know.
and because at that time, I think that even the court system was intimidated by public opinion and war pressure. Um, So that's what would happen.
Yeah, Mrs. Shimomura, that's one of the cases that the 11th graders look at
Right.
for junior term paper. They look at Supreme Court cases, and that's one of the popular ones that they study. Because obviously, my opinion is that Korematsu should not have lost. Okay, another great question is, what did your dad say the camps were like? Like, what were people doing there all day?
Well, I would say boring, because you ate at the mess hall, and everybody had a job. Either you worked at the mess hall, or like my father, he worked in the motor pool and drove a truck around. And later on, he actually worked as a fireman there, but he said he never had any fires or any major fire. Maybe a garbage can caught on fire or something. So there was a lot of just sitting around and waiting, and I think that was probably the worst kind of thing, because you felt like your whole life was passing you by, particularly the Nisei, because that's the age when you should be going to college, and they weren't. And some of them were able to leave the camps to do that, but many of them were not able to do that.
We're also curious, if there was a child in the internment camp, was there a school for the Japanese students?
Yes, they had a grammar school and high school, and they had teachers there. So there was, education. I wouldn't say that they were the best facilities, or even the best teachers, but there was schooling there. But talking about kids in camp, when the war started, there were like babies in hospitals, and some of them were in orphanages, and even those kids were put in camp. It's incomprehensible to me to think that a 6-month-old baby was going to be a spy or a saboteur, but in wartime, a lot of things happen that just don't make any sense.
So I know that you were telling us that the Tufts and the Bassetts were really kind to your family and made you feel like you wanted to come back. Your parents wanted to come back to Winters. Did they ever experience, though, any discrimination when they came back?
You and my parents? Yes, I'm sure that they did, but they never really talked about it to the children. In fact, they never really spoke very much about even being in the incarceration camps in Colorado. And I think most Nisei parents, second generation parents, felt that way, because when I talk to other of my friends about my age, they have the same story, is that that was a bad time in their life, and they didn't want to, quote, pass that burden on to the children. So
okay, so we have time for maybe one more question. I have a question in the chat from a student. And it is, how was it being the first JACL president? Did you experience any discrimination working in the legal field?
Yes, it was a transition, because at that time, if you were Japanese American and you were a dentist, or you were a gardener, or you were an optometrist, the white community accepted you. But if you were an attorney, well, they didn't, because it didn't feel the quite the same role. You know, here's a personal story. As I said, I worked for the State Attorney General's office, but you know, Bob Matsui, who was congressman at that time, set up a lunch for me to meet with some of the senior partners of one of the major law firms in
Oh, I guess that
Sacramento.
was the bell. Well,
Okay.
thank you everyone so much. And remember, if you have any questions, just email myself or Mrs. Masuda, and we'll get those questions to our guest speaker. And thank you everyone again so much. And we hope you learned a lot about winters and internment camps. Thank you, Mr. Baker. Thank you, Mrs. Masuda. Thank you, Beers, Barnes, Gonzalez, Guy, and all of our students. Thank you so much. Almost got to that story. That bell. Okay, I think everyone's leaving. Okay, well, maybe I'll get the rest of that story and we can share that with them. Okay, Mrs. Masuda, we'll see you after school.
Yeah, I'll come swing by real quick and say hi.
Are you coming to the office right now?
Yeah, I'll come say hi real quick.
Okay, come to the office. We'll be here.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.